Childhood events, history of abuse, brain damage. If our brains determine what we do, in what sense can we make sense of morality, even legal responsibility?
所以我变成一个不负责的男人。
我觉得他们应该试着为自己行为负责。
我们其实都是提线木偶。
There are no free will.
No, I'm not quite saying that.
我们跟机器人其实没有什么两样。
Does that make us some type of AI?
It's not AI.
Can I describe these androids as human pre-consciousness?
自由意志根本就不存在。
Is this the perspective from you to tell us that we might have this possibility of living in a simulation?
Sometimes we will do things that can't be explained.
Exactly.
It frightens me.
There's nothing to be frightened about.
How do I stop my unconsciousness?
英国心理学会意识与体验学部的联合创始人以及前任主席、伦敦大学心理学的荣休教授，直面大家的疑问。
I think we're living in a very confused world. We really do need to understand ourselves more clearly.
其实我一直都比较向往什么都不多想的简单生活，可是莫名其妙的坏知识总是有办法找上我。我好奇别人对于这些知识是否与我有着相同的感受，我好奇这些知识的尽头究竟是善还是恶，我好奇你是不是跟我一样好奇，所以我要拉着你陪我一起忍受这些坏知识。
Hello， 大家好，我是 Coca 谢小叶。接下来呢，我要给大家分享一下为什么我会做这一期的坏知识的节目内容。其实呢，它起源于一次我的采访，有一位受访者他跟我说，他在看一位非常著名的科学家的演讲的时候呢，发现这位科学家提到，我们其实都是提线木偶，我们跟机器人其实没有什么两样，还有我们的自由意志根本就不存在。
There's some experimental evidence by now.That when you undertake a voluntary action, like say picking this up, very briefly before you are conscious of making the decision, the parts of your brain that are organizing the action are already active. This mystery of what the puppeteer is doing is probably pre-conscious.
后来呢，我就找来了很多相关的书，从而也就了解到了更多的相关的科学实验。而这些实验呢，都证明说，其实我们所做的每个选择，都是在我们意识到它们的存在之前，就已经被我们的大脑自己决定了。那么我一直引以为傲的，我不顾爸爸妈妈的反对，而自己决定成为一名主持人这件事情，那它也不是我的意识所做的决定吗？我陷入了一种混乱跟恐惧之中，但是呢，毕竟我一个人的感受应该是比较片面的吧，所以我非常想要知道其他人在了解到这个知识之后会是什么样的一种反应。于是呢，我找来了6位截然不同的朋友，我非常想要知道这6位朋友在他们了解到这个坏知识之后，是否跟我一样感觉到三观崩塌了。毕竟我不想一个人塌。从小到大到现在为止，你为自己做过的最重大的一个决定是什么？
小的时候其实就是有写过说长大要当一个演员，
应该是培养了一个能够持续终身的爱好，看星星。
辞职来美国，我觉得是我完全改写我人生一个非常重要的决定。
我放弃了大学的 offer， 然后去自然队训练。
最重要的决定就是退学之后我就去工作了几年，然后再重新去考大学的时候，我当时已经是25岁，
可能就是选择了这个工作吧。
那您觉得这个决定是你自己的意识为自己做的决定吗？
是的，
非常肯定。
对，
我觉得这不是自己决定，就好像是一个非常自然的过程。
我觉得潜意识是占了非常主导地位的一个因素。
是，其实我每次选择有一个黑暗中的东西在那边，肯定是走不下去了嘛，你才会去选择
你说是意识行为吗？我不觉得是什么意识行为。
这个肯定是我自己主观决定了。如果我自己主观上没有这个想去学，我肯定也考不了。
接下来我想要跟您展示的一些新的信息，这些新的信息呢，有可能会带来一些困扰或者是疑惑，但是它确实是现在的心理学家和科学家们至少目前所证实的信息。那您觉得还想要继续听下去吗？
那没问题啊，就没问题，没问题啊。
我也想知道是什么可以挑战我的三观。
在1982年的时候，加州大学旧金山分校有一位心理学家本杰明·里比特，找来了一群志愿者，用脑电记录装置来监测他们的脑电活动，给他们下达的命令就是：一旦你意识到有动手指的这个决定，那你就动下手指。最后这个实验出来的结果发现，他们决定要动手指之前，他们的大脑运动皮层早就已经自己发出了动手指的指令，就是所谓的我们决定要动手指的这个意识，完全不决定我们动不动手指这个行为。意识决定我们的行为，这一个想法其实完全是一种幻觉。我们的意识更多的是一个后知后觉，但是无法插手的旁观者。现在带着这个全新的视角再去回想当时的这个做决定的过程，你还觉得这个是你的自我意识做的决定吗？
我觉得从现在来看，怎么做的这个决定，我觉得是自己的意识的决定比较合理。
是意识在做决定，这其实两者不冲突。我意识在做决定，是我认为什么什么什么，但是我没有办法解释我认为是不是这是我的主观意识行为。
就是您认为说，您也可以说是意识做了这个决定，但其实它背后可能是潜意识各种各样的因素，然后由潜意识做的决定，只是我以为我认为我的意识做的决定。
对，
现在想的话，我觉得肯定还是可能大脑给予身体的反馈，或者是这个神经上啊，所有这个东西吧，它会让我认识到就是这个事儿得去干，所以我就去干了。但可能说我无法解释的时候，我就把它归成这个主观意识。
如果按照刚才的理论的话，那应该是我的潜意识它帮我已经做好了这个决定，然后最后的话我的意识在相当于自我催眠一样告诉我，我要去参加比赛，我要学跳。
可能10%吧，10%就是还是陷入到说愿意有那个 illusion， 说我是这个事情的主导者这样。
虽然知道了这明明是个 illusion， 但是你也享受这个 illusion。
对，
多少还是有一些，因为我不能说我完全就被说服，因为我自己没有研究，我没有很多论证的论据可以让我完全的信服这个。但是因为有了这个新的知识点以后，就更笃定的相信我的潜意识是当时做这个决定里面占了非常大成分的一个因素。至少我受过的教育告诉我，世界上没有什么是100%的。
我觉得这个是一个很难解释的一个东西，很难解释的一个，就是我说什么话，我做什么事都不是我的决定，是我的潜意识的决定。那我的潜意识又是怎么来决定的呢？
潜意识哪里来的？我们能不能控制这个产生潜意识的源头？如果我控制了那个构成我潜意识的因素，那我不就可以控制我的潜意识了吗？
就假如说我知道这事，然后我犯罪了，这怪不怪我，还是怪你们？
那大家可以看到，这6位朋友他们的反应可以说是各不相同，但是在他们当中有没有正确答案的存在呢？带着这个疑问，我就找到了我之前阅读的相关书籍《理解意识》的作者，他也是伦敦大学心理学的荣休教授，英国心理学会意识与体验学部的联合创始人，以及前任主席 Velmans 教授。那么他对于这一个问题又会做什么样的解释呢
？All the problems that people raised and all the puzzles that the people had, I think, were perfectly natural puzzles to have. All their, if you like, instincts about how it was for them, where they say, but I feel I can do this, or I could do that, and I had some control, and so on. There is a sense in which everybody was right.
Can you please elaborate on why you think all of them are right, even though they seem to have quite different opinions after hearing this theory?
I'm going to give you a quick answer. But the long answer requires a longer answer, and so there are two aspects really. how things look from a first-person perspective and how things look from a third-person perspective. You might go to the doctor and say, look, I have a pain in my stomach. And that's a first-person perspective view of what's going on in your stomach. And then the doctor might actually have various diagnostic tests from a third-person perspective and locate an ulcer in your stomach. We naturally combine these views in order to try and work out what's going on in the world. And then just noticing the appearing of thoughts and feelings, and they seem to appear out of emptiness. And that's indeed how it appears from a first-person perspective. But from a third-person scientific point of view, the notion that something precedes a feeling, precedes a wish to do something, isn't that surprising?
What you just talked about actually reminded me of meditation in Buddhism. People who practice meditation might find out that from a first-person perspective, all is out there in the end is emptiness.
Exactly. And that's a first-person perspective. In some way, in the end, one has to relate those first-person explorations, which have gone on for thousands of years in practices such as Buddhism, to, if you like, the other perspective, which is emerging from these Western scientific explorations of what are essentially the same processes. And in the end, we won't be happy until we, in some way, find a way of synthesizing those things in a way that seems to make more or less sense. That's part of the challenge.
在和大家交流之后，我们决定让大家一起来一次连线。我们让教授来直面大家的疑问，同时呢，也希望教授可以解答科学实验所观察到的已经被事先决定好的意识，和我们平时所体会到的拥有自由选择权的意识，到底怎么样才可以兼容呢？
Hello everyone. In this talk I'm going to introduce the topic of how to understand conscious free will, and that will require us to understand two things. One is the role of consciousness in free will, and the second thing is how free will really is. So how free is free will? Within philosophy, in order to be free, in order to have free will, there must be some part of us, a conscious soul or something of that kind, that operates entirely outside of these physical principles. And that's sometimes called contra-causal free will. Normally, we entirely accept, for example, that we operate within physical constraints and within social constraints or interpersonal constraints. I don't feel free to fly, for example. I only feel free to move my bodies in the ways that are actually afforded by the limbs that I've been born with. I don't feel able in any social situation to ignore interpersonal consequences of my action. So if I was sitting next to a complete stranger on a bus, for example, I wouldn't just put my arm around them, even if I was just trying to be friendly. And that's not contra-causal free will. It's not outside of the chain of physical causation. It's a form of constrained free will, if you like. And so really the interesting question for us is whether we actually have the freedom to choose or decide, and indeed to act in ways that we actually experience ourselves to be. This topic is interesting in a number of different ways because it contrasts three ways of thinking about who we really are, what we're really like. The first one is we really are as exactly how we experience ourselves to be, as conscious agents able to control what we do. And the second way that we often think of ourselves is how science describes us. Bodies operate in a certain way, our brains operate in a certain way, and we tend to assume that those ways are determined by physical principles. A third issue that's really interesting, if we're talking about conscious free will, is what actually is the relationship between the conscious self and the unconscious self? Now, why is this topic important? Unless we truly have a degree of freedom to choose, decide and act, how can we be held responsible for those acts? If we can't be held responsible for those acts, in what sense can we make sense of morality? even legal responsibility, and that has practical consequences which affect our legal systems. If our brains determine what we do, and if these operate on determinate physical principles, could we have done otherwise? And if not, can we be held responsible? Defendants often, if they can plead mitigating circumstances, for example, childhood events or history of abuse or perhaps brain damage, that to some extent can be explanatory. So, free will versus determinism plays itself out in the courts. In neuroscience, Kornhuber and Dieck in 1965, for example, have been studying activity in the brain which preceded simple motor acts. They noticed that voluntary acts are preceded by a slow negative shift in electrical potential that you can pick up with an EEG recorded at the scalp, which they call the readiness potential. And that shift can precede a simple voluntary act by, say, a second or more. You would expect that if the brain is getting ready to carry out an act of some kind, that it needs to prepare itself, and that preparation takes time. But this topic really became interesting when Benjamin Libet asked a different question. Rather than just being interested in the relationship of the readiness potential in the brain to an action, he was interested in the relationship of the readiness potential to the wish to carry out an act. So he had a situation in which subjects were required to do something really simple, like flex their finger. Like Kornhuber and Dieck, back in 1965, he'd found that the initial readiness potential preceded the act of flexing the finger by a range of times ranging from a second to just 550 milliseconds. But the experienced wish to move, while it also preceded the act, preceded it by quite a bit less, by just 200 milliseconds. The brain was preparing itself to move at least half a second before the movement, but the experienced wish to move only preceded the act by about 200 milliseconds. The simple conclusion is that the brain was actually getting itself ready to move 300 to 350 milliseconds before people even experienced the wish to do so. And that suggested that the brain might be actually preparing to act, and the experienced wish followed that preparation. As you can imagine, that produced quite a stir and quite a debate. Libet himself was not at all happy about the consequences for human agency because he was well aware of the implications. And so his own attempt to rescue conscious free will, noting that although the wish followed the readiness potential by 300 milliseconds, the wish still preceded the actual act by 200 milliseconds. And that was time enough, so he argued, to veto the act. And so he said, we might not have free will, but we do have free won't. So we can deliberately decide not to do something. That in turn, of course, raises other kinds of problem because you might say, look, it's easy to accept that there are lots of processes you're required to decide to wish to do something. But if you decide, given the situation you're in, that you won't do it, wouldn't that itself require deliberation of some kind? So, in fact, the decision not to do something, given that you want to do it, could actually be regarded as more complex than the wish to do it. These relationships between conscious experiences and mental processing, shall we say, don't apply only in the case of free will. So far we've been talking just about very simple movements. But if one goes to the other extreme and reflects on what's going on, what I'm doing at the moment, for example, which is speaking to you, that's much more complicated than just moving a finger. And we think of, I'm doing this consciously. So what's the role of consciousness in what I'm doing? Speech production is another major area which has been extensively explored within psychological science to go through just some of the main stages which have to be involved. To begin with, there has to be an idea to express. So when I'm talking to you, I've got some sort of encoding of meaning in my mind brain somewhere, which needs to be expressed in words. And then I have to use words. So somewhere out of a kind of internal dictionary, I have to access the right words. And then I'm speaking to you in English, and so somewhere in my mind I have to access the syntactic rules of English. I have to string the words together into a meaningful sentence. And then somehow or other, all that planning needs to be converted into motor programs that exit from the central nervous system and make the articulatory system operate in an appropriate way. And the articulatory system is extremely complex. It involves the larynx, the lips, opening, closing, breathing, coordination. The tongue is moving backwards and forwards within the mouth. The nasal cavities opening and closing. The tongue might make as many as 12 adjustments of shape per second. Within 1 minute of discourse, as many as 10 to 15,000 neuromuscular events. In other words, instructions coming from the central nervous system to make just that last bit work. But then I ask myself, what am I actually conscious of? Well, the only thing I'm actually conscious of is what I hear myself say. Now, I can see my hand moving around, and it has a certain intonation pattern as well. But that results, what I hear myself say results from all this planning and processing and instruction of the articulatory system. And none of that actually enters my normal consciousness. In fact, there is a sense in which I'm only conscious of what I want to say after I've actually said it. Prior to that, it was just if you like, a preconscious thought. And speech production isn't a special case either. Consider, for example, the sentence which I've just placed on the screen for you. What you need to do with the sentence is just read it silently to yourself. And once you've read it, you should have what we call inner speech. If you're like me and a normal English speaker, what you hear is a kind of inner version of, if we don't increase the dustman's wages, they will refuse to take the refuse. Now, there's something really interesting about that, and that is that one word appears twice, and that's the word refuse. In one's verbal imagery, the stress patterns are different for the two appearances. So the first time it appeared came up immediately as refuse, and the second time it appeared as refuse. And the first version, refuse, is a verb, and the second, refuse, is a noun. And the question is, how did you know? And the only conclusion one can draw, really, is that the syntactic and semantic analysis that you needed to carry out to determine the appropriate meanings of that word must have taken place prior to the allocation of the stress patterns. And that, in turn, must have taken place prior to the verbal images entering your awareness. And like speech, where I wasn't aware of all the processes that preceded my ability to say something, when you read, you're not aware of any of the processes required for you to read something. Now we're going to do something really counterintuitive. Just decide how well you're following the argument so far, and simply note what thoughts come to your mind. Just observe those thoughts. Now, it doesn't really matter what did come to mind. You might have thought, I'm with what's going on so far, I understand it, or I'm not sure about some of it, or, I really disagree with some of this. But it really doesn't matter for the purposes of this little experiment. All that matters is that a thought did come to mind, and when it did come to mind, like in the case of the reading, it manifested in the form of inner speech. And now you have to ask yourself, where did that thought come from? And just as before, we have little or no introspective access to all the detailed processes that gave rise to that thought. So somehow or other, in order to come to your conclusion about whether you're following this argument or not, you somehow had to analyze the meaning of the question involving reading, with all its complexity, in order to get that meaning, once you got that meaning, you had to access your global memory system or your global knowledge store, your understanding of the whole topic, if you like, the nature of mind or your own mind or whatever. And somehow you had to make a judgment about how well the arguments that I'm presenting here fit into your own understanding, your own intuitive understanding of all this. You either came to the conclusion that, yes, you were following it, no, you weren't following it, yes, you agreed with it, no, you didn't agree with it, and so on. Again, you're only conscious of the thought after it arises. You're not conscious of these preliminary processes. What you're conscious is of the conclusion of those processes. So in 1991, I did an analysis of behavioral and brain sciences called Is Human Information Processing Conscious?, where I did a far more detailed analysis of the whole of human information processing and looked at far greater detail than we're able to do here. Many other processes as well, including creativity and memory and learning and so on. And again, free will is not a special case. For the moment, I just want to suggest to you a general rule which follows from the examples that I've actually given you, which is that conscious phenomenology usually follows the information processing to which it most closely relates. And that applies, as we've demonstrated, not just to conscious wishes to do something simple or to act or that wish or not, as in the case of free will experiments, conscious speech production, conscious reading, and conscious thinking, to all forms of conscious human information processing. And that brings us to a really interesting and deep issue, which is, what does the conscious phenomenology actually do? Actually, when we talk about a conscious mental processing, the mainstream literature of philosophy and scientific literature commonly confuse three quite distinct senses in which we talk about a mental process being conscious. The first sense, we're actually conscious of the process. There are a few mental processes that are like that. So, for example, if someone is asking you to carry out a complex bit of mathematical calculation, like multiply a number, 341, say, by 25, and then you work out the easiest way to do that is to add 2 noughts to 321 and try and divide it mentally by 4. So you're conscious of the process. A much more common way that processes are said to be conscious is if they're accompanied by consciousness of the results of that processing. So, for example, the processes that we've been looking at in this talk so far are like that. I'm conscious of what I'm saying, you're conscious of what you're reading, but I'm not conscious of the details of how I come to be conscious of that. An entirely third sense in which we talk about a process being conscious is in the sense that consciousness enters into or causally influences that process. The intuitive instinct is that the consciousness is actually doing something. But being conscious of a process doesn't mean that the consciousness is responsible for the operation of that process. So, for example, being conscious of paint drying on the wall isn't what actually makes it dry on the wall. And that's really what's implicit in the whole issue of conscious free will. What I want to suggest is that conscious experiences provide a way of directly knowing something or realizing what's going on. The word realize is an important word in the work I do, and I need to hyphenate it, real eyes, in order to convey the idea that in directly experiencing something, it becomes part of one's subjective reality. So let's summarize the argument so far. Free will, or volitional processing, if you like, is conscious in the sense that conscious wishes and decisions result from pre-conscious volitional processing in our own mind brains. And the fact that we have these conscious appearances enable us to actually realize what's going on. So we have a conscious sense of what we want, what we've decided, and so on, which represents the state of our current volitional processes. Purely in terms of these conscious manifestations, we can explain what's happening in our minds from a first-person perspective. Nevertheless, we're left with, if you like, the findings of the science, which suggests that volitional processes themselves operate pre-consciously and they follow deterministic principles. We still have to ask in what sense they're free. If you look at volitional processing of the complexity that we normally exhibit, in order to get the system to do anything, you'd have to build in inner goals or needs that operate as drivers to get the system to act. You'd have to build in a global knowledge store. In other words, we act in a context, and that context is a context of understanding the world around us, which we've stored, if you like, from a lifetime of interaction with the world, which, if you like, guides any choices that we make. And then you have to build in processes which model current inner states as well as current external states. Also processes which represent changes that we want to produce in either of those. Then you'd have to include the ability to formulate alternative strategies for action, because we can. There isn't just one way that we can accomplish an end. And likewise, a processing system that could do this would have to have those possibilities. You'd also have to build in some method for assessing the likely success of alternative strategies in the light of existing physical and social constraints. And that will feed into the actual choices and decisions we make. Now, if you built such a system, although there's no doubt that it would follow deterministic principles, the operation of the whole system needs to be partly self-organizing and flexible in order to exercise choices and formulate strategies and so on. The conscious experiences we have, of wishes and deciding and so on, represent these complex processes going on in our own minds. And the illusion is simply to confuse the conscious representation of volitional processing with the processing itself. But equally, there's another sense in which conscious free will is usually not an illusion. One has to accept that the conscious representations of anything really necessarily follow what they're representations of. If we feel we're free to choose within certain constraints, the likelihood is that our own decision-making processes that determine the choices we make really did have those degrees of freedom within those constraints. So to sum it up, our own flexible, sophisticated, volitional and decision-making processes provide a form of pre-conscious free will that is compatible with what we experience. And then we get into a really interesting question, which is, who is it that's really in control? Who are we really? Who is the agent? Habitually, we do think of ourselves as just being our conscious selves in terms of how we experience ourselves to be. But we've now come to the conclusion that these different facets of our experienced conscious selves are generated by and represent aspects of our own pre-conscious minds. So what are we? Well, according to this way of looking at things, we're both the pre-conscious generating processes and the conscious results. So here we have a picture of what's going on. As you can see, there's an iceberg. Just the tip of it is out of the water. The rest of it is below the water. And this is a classical model of the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious mind within psychology. Basically, in the picture, consciousness, that which enters consciousness, is just the tip of the iceberg in the light, if you like, sticking out of the water. And just below the conscious tip, there's the pre-conscious mind, which supports the conscious tip, but also has some access into consciousness. Below that, we have the unconscious mind, the truly unconscious, but doesn't have access to consciousness at any particular moment in time. And the whole of The iceberg is embedded in and supported by the surrounding sea. And in our own case, what that means is that our consciousness, bodies and brains are embedded in and supported by a surrounding sea of energy and information. Looked at that way, you get into this very interesting question of who am I? Because normally we completely identify who we are with just the conscious tip sticking out of the water. Once you realize that actually your own conscious experience is supported by this wealth of unconscious and pre-conscious processing, which in turn is in relationship, if you like, with the surrounding sea, you get into this very interesting question of, where does my sense of self begin and end? And this also has, if you like, immediate psychological consequences, because when we identify just with what's presented in consciousness, it almost seems as if that's free-floating and disconnected from everything, when actually we're embedded in everything, and we couldn't even exist, without its support. What is often talked about as self-realization can also be thought of in this metaphor as extending the light of the conscious tip more deeply into the nature of the ground of being, if you like, thereby realizing it, making it psychologically real. That produces a process of greater connectedness, feeling of connectedness, and so on. And then finally, we get back to, if you like, the nub of this particular talk. Am I responsible for what I do? Can I really exercise conscious free will and be held responsible for what I do? Which is absolutely central to having morals, devising ethics. It plays out in practical ways in the law courts and so on. The answer that follows from this line of reasoning is an unequivocal yes. Yes, we are responsible. One has to accept that the conscious experiences themselves may not in themselves be responsible. They just represent, the rest of my unconscious and pre-conscious processing. But the whole of me is responsible, as I am all those things. I am my unconscious and pre-conscious mind, body, and brain, as well as my conscious experience. If you like, a complex, dynamic, psychophysical being that is capable of choosing, deciding, being held responsible for what I do, and so on. And I think at that point I should stop and invite questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Velmans. Thank you for sharing with us. So now let's get to the question part, and we're going to start with Zhang Ying. Please go ahead.
One thing struck me very deeply is what you talked about free will and free wants. I am a mother of two, and children can be very naughty and a lot to handle. They can make me mad every day. And sometimes I will be mad. I will explode. But sometimes I can hold it. When I hold it back, I think that is my consciousness tells me to hold it back. So I think that's my conscience made the decision. As I make the decision, I won't be mad.
I'd say it's your conscious being, or the conscious aspects of your being, allows you to control your reactions and so on. When you, for instance, get into the business of child screaming and you feel, you want to aggressively stop them and then you stop yourself, is that particular sequence of events. You hear something and then you feel something and then you come to a decision. It's still under your control. These are voluntary processes that you can control, although the anger might be coming, involuntarily. It's coming from a deep part of child screaming. It produces a kind of instinctive reaction. It's actually programmed to be unpleasant, in order to get our attention and so on.
There are no free will.
No, there is free will. If you go back to the iceberg model, tip of the iceberg, which is sticking out of the water, which we tend to identify with, that's the actual conscious experience, right? We're just talking about the conscious experience, but actually we're talking about the process as well, and the details of the process.
So both my conscious self and my unconscious self will make decision.
They both enter into the decision you make, but sometimes stuff comes up from the unconscious self. Once it has entry into consciousness, at that moment in time, that bit of you is conscious. Say you're doing psychotherapy or something. Through a long process of psychotherapy, things emerge from your childhood. You've completely forgotten, which influence your current life. It's brought into your consciousness. You're able to deal with it in a different way because it's now part of your conscious self. It's like the light of the conscious tip has gone down the iceberg a little bit.
Sometimes I will do things that can't be explained.
Exactly. And then you're in an instance where you're under the control of an unconscious bit of you, a bit of yourself that you haven't reclaimed, if you like, in consciousness.
This theory does explain a lot of things. When I did something wrong, maybe that is my unconscious self made the decision. It also frightens me. How do I stop myself from making wrong decisions? How do I stop my unconsciousness?
I mean, basically, everybody's in this situation to some extent. So whether it's coming from one's conscious self or one's unconscious self, at some point or another, we will be making wrong decisions. The way you know is in terms of outcomes. That becomes, a clear opportunity for thinking, no, if I'm faced with that situation again, I'm not going to react in quite that way again. I'll perhaps try something different. So there's nothing really mysterious here. There's nothing to be frightened about. What you're talking about is a situation that every human being faces because the world is just so complex and the interactions we enter into are so complex. It works out more than it doesn't work out. That itself is a kind of learning process that we all go through. And I don't think we have any option but to accept that's part of the human journey, really, in complex social situations.
Thank you so much. I think I've known myself better after this talk.
Thank you, Zhang Ying. I believe that we will all get a better understanding of ourselves after this talk. Next, let's go to Leo. I remember before this lecture, Leo actually had a very specific question about if our behaviors are determined by our pre-consciousness, then how does our pre-consciousness work? So after hearing the voluntary process and the iceberg model Professor Velmans has given us, what kind of questions do you still have, Leo?
The picture you showed us with the surrounding sea of the conditions and knowledge, can we say that those are the things that are programmed into us? So we don't even know they're existing because they're already programmed into us. And does that make us some type of AI?
Okay, AI, artificial intelligence. In one sense, what you're saying is true. We don't choose to be born as human beings, be born into the bodies that we find ourselves in. And those bodies are biologically evolved through which we live our lives. We have no way of setting the basic control of how those vessels work. So we were born with certain drives, urges, a particular social situation, a particular culture, and so on. Even the bodies themselves are bedded into a kind of environment which sustains the bodies. And there's all sorts of information around us all the time, which we're picking up and reacting to and adjusting to. And none of that is under our conscious control. In a way, you can say it's programmed. It's not AI because it's not artificial. It's I without the A. So, we're these intelligent beings that have emerged in a particular form as a result of evolutionary processes. And then we kind of wind up in this world thinking, who am I? Or what's going on? What's it all about? And so on.
Volunteering system that you mentioned that we kind of established through the evolution even before I was born. However, let's say the first human being, where did he or she get this kind of voluntary system from? If there was no conditions before, where did that first human acquire this?
Adopt an ancient insight, which is that nothing arises from nothing. There always are preconditions. The evolution of human beings is a very gradual process. And what was right at the bottom of it? Where did it all come from? And in a way, the answer to that question is as similar to where did all the matter come from? Why is there anything rather than nothing? What we do know is what is here now, reverse engineer. You have to kind of think backwards. We found ourselves as embodied beings able to experience the world and ourselves. That's what I take as my starting point. How did my body come to be like this, which is the question you asked. How is it possible for me to experience all this? The seeds of all that. And then you'd have to construct an evolutionary story, which would be a particular take on how all that might have evolved.
About the consciousness and unconsciousness reminds me somehow about quantum theory and the ontology of the very nature of reality. Is this the psychophysical perspective from you to tell us that we might have this possibility of living in a simulation?
Quick answer is, when you say a simulation, that means you're simulating something else. But what I want to say is that there is a sense in which, for instance, the actual experienced world you're living in now is a kind of virtual reality. And it's very easy to see that that's the case. What's out here, when you're looking at the screen, is just my face, and hands moving around on the screen. And the reason that this screen appears as it does is the result of a very complex interaction between, if you like, that basic physics and the basic physics and biology, which make up our own bodies, including our perceptual and cognitive systems and so on. We experience the reality of what's there in a very particular way, a very human way. It's a version of reality, in the same way that a virtual reality can be a version of the reality that it's representing. It's not the fullness of it. Otherwise we wouldn't call it a virtual reality.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me, because I studied media studies before. I actually had a theory before similar to this one, is about the media reality. So all the fake news talk that we're talking right now in the US basically is a media reality that we are consuming from media. Something similar to that, but definitely different. It just reminds me that.
Thank you, Leo. Yeah, actually, thank you, because your comparison between the media reality and the virtual reality that Professor Velmans was talking about helped me a lot to understand this discussion better. And when Leo mentioned AI, I saw Jingyu was like, that's my topic. So yeah, now let's go to Jingyu. As an algorithm engineer, what kind of questions do you have?
Yeah, so this question is related to my profession. So I work as an algorithm engineer, and my job, to simply put, is to build androids that recognizes roadside objects as accurately as possible. The androids that we design, they have an inner goal, which is to detect objects, and they are trained from a vast amount of data, and they decide what objects are present in the end. Can I describe these androids as a modeling of the human pre-consciousness?
There is a kind of dynamic interaction between developments in cognitive psychology and AI. It works in two ways. So if, for example, you've got a theory about how human beings do these things, and you manage to capture it completely, in your AI model, in your case, you're actually producing a car that will drive as well as a human being. Now, at that point, you might say, okay, well, that's a viable model of how human beings do it. You could say those are voluntary processes. I would agree with you there. But psychophysical system actually achieves the same end is quite different. Or for example, with, let's say, chess-playing computers that simply use a speed of operation to process big chunks of data, whereas human beings are much more likely to use heuristics, strategies, and so on. So you can get very good chess-playing machines that are operating on a different way to the way the human beings are doing it. Could you regard the AI system as having voluntary processes, particularly when you've built in goals, directions, and strategies for achieving those goals and so on? Yes, I would say yes. But whether that's conscious or not is a separate question. There might be, in inverted commas, nobody at home. It might be just a machine doing things, a computer virus reproducing, but that doesn't mean it's conscious. It's just a bit of code, if you like.
So are you suggesting that as long as the machines and the humans come to the same end in terms of driving, the machines that we design doesn't necessarily need to model the human consciousness.
What human voluntary processes, they need not be the same, no. They might be, and they'll tend to be inspired by, how we think we might do it. But that doesn't mean to say that we know enough about how we operate in order to be sure that it's the same.
I see. Okay, I think that summarizes my question.
Thank you, Jingyuan. Thank you, Professor. So I have one last question, because except for the Libet's experiment, we also learned about another experiment that happened in 2008. And this experiment found out that one who believes in determinism tends to cheat. As you said, some people might use this theory to claim that they're no longer responsible for their crimes. So in this sense, do you think this is a bad knowledge?
My own understanding of conscious free will and all the scientific literature is such that it actually deepens our understanding of ourselves while still leaving us responsible for our acts, something that's really needed in this time because people feel alienated, unconnected. This kind of any way of deepening our understanding of what it is that is unfulfilled or what it is that's disconnected, it can only be beneficial in the long run. We must be careful not to get lost in a little bit of science. As they say, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing because you misinterpret it and people misuse it then. In that way, it can be dangerous.
So the bad is the new good.
Well, the bad is a preliminary to a completely different understanding, which is the new good. It's not really bad. The bad is just the challenge. Unless we challenge the way we think about things we're taking for granted at this time, the world's in a bit of a mess, to be frank. And part of the mess is our lack of understanding of ourselves. So anything that contributes to that potentially can be of benefit.
Thank you, Professor Velmans. Thank you so much for this meaningful lecture. And thank you everyone else for bringing your sincere questions to the show. We cannot produce a better show without you guys, our bad students. All right, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, and goodbye. Goodbye.
那么在听完教授的讲解之后，其实我还有一丝小小的疑惑，就是如果教授他认为我们的潜意识具有自由选择权的话，那么潜意识在众多的备选方案当中，一旦选择了一个选项，那么难道这一个选择就不是被事先决定好的吗？当然，一直纠结于我是否是自己的主人，我觉得这个不是最重要的，因为我呢，它包括我的潜意识、我的意识，也包括我的无意识。所以我这个整体就是应该为我所有的行为负责任，否则呢，这个基于个人负责制的社会体系就有可能崩塌。我相信这是任何一个研究者都不想要看到的结局。我猜这也是为什么大家都在试图挽救和保护自由意志的存在。那么更重要的到底是什么呢？我认为通过这个知识找到我和曾经过往的一切，以及这个世界更深层次的连结，这个才是最重要的。当然，和这个坏知识达成和解之后，我一方面有一种如释重负的感觉，但是另一方面呢，又有一种这个担忧又悠悠地升了起来，就是我和接下来这一系列的坏知识是否都能够达成和解呢？